still in Isaiah, coming up on a very important passage, but we're actually not starting there today. It's still about the decline of the nation and seeing all of these things that that has happened to the nation over these years, and these pronouncements of judgment for their disobedience and the coming of the Babylonians that's in their future. And that's important. Y'all be praying for me today because I don't feel as prepared as I should be. But we're starting really in Luke chapter 4. In looking at the life of Messiah Yeshua. At this point in Luke chapter 4, he's going back into the region around the Galilee, and he even goes home, goes back to his local synagogue, the one that he grew up in, for Shabbat. And it's a very opportune time in his life. He's been announced by John the Baptist, John the Immerser at the Jordan. He's just come out of facing temptation in the wilderness for 40 days. He's essentially at the beginning of his public ministry. And so the local prodigy, in our day it'd be like the star quarterback, the one that gets noticed, around the nation, but Yeshua gets noticed especially up in Jerusalem. He has come back. Now, we just had the kids up here for the blessing. Can you imagine having Yeshua in your synagogue growing up? I mean, how awkward that would be. Not for him, but for us, right? The one who was a genius level knowledge of the scriptures. Do you think he mispronounced anything? Probably not, right? But he was amazing, leading scholars in Jerusalem when he was just 12 years old. I suspect, as a local rising pupil, he was probably given that special privilege in the synagogue, being a frequent reader in the Torah. We only do that once a month, and sometimes it's a challenge for us, just to do that once. It came naturally for him. I'd be shocked if Yeshua, as he was getting older, wasn't regularly reading from the Haftorah, from the prophets. And what's so amazing about reading from the prophets, how many of them are going to be about Messiah? Can you imagine having him in your synagogue, having him reading the prophets, and he's just kind of standing there like, I wonder who this is about. But he's coming home, he's come home for the weekend, so to speak. So, I could easily see him standing or stepping back into that role that everybody's used to have him playing. Which is why I think he naturally gets up to read when the time came in Luke chapter 4. He says, and he came to Nazereth, where he had been raised, as was his custom. He went into the synagogue on Shabbat, and he got up to read. So apparently that was the common practice for him when he was home. He got up to read. And when the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, he unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written. So he's in Isaiah. Some suggest that Yeshua, when you look at traditional commentaries, they'll tell you that he could pick pretty much anything he wanted to out of the prophets. And if that's accurate, then it's very telling, it's very significant that he chose the passage that he chooses to start out, to kickstart, to define his role and his ministry and his purpose. Of course, there are others that suggest that the Haftorah, the readings, had already been set in place since about the time of the Maccabees, when those Greek overlords had outlawed the reading of the Torah. And if that's accurate, if that's the way it was happening, then this passage is providentially, by God's arranging of circumstance, just happens to be the one that is read on the day Yeshua arrives to announce his ministry, his purpose, and his goal. Either way, It's a big deal what he chooses or what is being read on that day. And he quotes from right where we're at. He quotes from Isaiah chapter 61. Luke records the version that's in the Septuagint, the Greek translation. He says, the Ruach Elohim is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of Adonai's favor. All of a sudden, Isaiah is talking about the year of Adonai's favor. After everything he's been saying, after everything he's been talking about, after the judgment that he says is coming their way, after laying out what Messiah is going to do, he doesn't ever want them to lose hope of the fact that his favor is still coming to them. And it's the arrival of Messiah. It's the arrival of the Anointed One that coincides with the year of his favor, with the long-awaited year of Jubilee, when release and freedom are proclaimed throughout the land, when you didn't have money, when you didn't have enough, and you had to sell things off, especially your land or your inheritance, that would be returned to you. That 50th year of Jubilee. You know, the 50th year after counting 7 Shemitah cycles, 7 Sabbath years, 7 weeks. When the land, you know, every 7th year the land is supposed to rest, right? They're supposed to have been giving it time to rest. It's that 50th year that the debts are canceled, that those in bondage are set free, when inheritance is returned to its rightful owner. You know, most in the population, especially those who had to sell off, you know, part of their inheritance, those who had to become indentured servants because of debts and things like that. Most of the population longed to see this day or this year of Adonai's favor, because it's like getting to start over. It's better than declaring bankruptcy, right? Which we see a lot of people doing. It's better than that. You get these things back. But the problem is nobody had actually seen it. It hadn't really ever been fully implemented. It's kind of like a politician that, you know, when they're on the campaign trail, they make a lot of promises, right? No matter who they are, they promise certain things that we hear these promises every 2 or every 4 years, but so many times the politician either can't do what he says he's going to do, or most likely he never really intended to. He or she never really intended to keep the promises. And this Jubilee has almost functioned like that. You know, consider the Babylonians that are coming. When Isaiah writes this, you know, they haven't arrived yet, but the duration of the Babylonian exile lasted how many years? Do y'all remember? Lasted 70 years. And the time period, the length of that, the duration was set according to Jeremiah, because they had refused to keep that 7-year cycle of rest. They had refused to do the Shemitah cycle when they were supposed to let the land rest, when they were supposed to let debts be forgiven. Chronicles puts it like this. It says, he exiled to Babylon those who had escaped the sword, and they became slaves to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia, in fulfillment of the word of Adonai by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had paid back the debt, paid back her Shabbat rest. For as long as it lay desolate, the Shabbat rest was kept until 70 years were complete. So essentially, the length of time that this judgment was coming to God's people was because they hadn't been keeping this 7-year Shemitah cycle. So for every 7th year that they didn't do it, they spent a year in exile. And so 70 years times 7 is how many years? 490. For 490 years that the kingdom was functioning and operating, they were not keeping that 7-year cycle of rest. And if they're not keeping the one that happens every 7 years, then what are they really going to keep the one that happens every 50? No. Now, what does that say about us and Shabbat? This one's hits a little more frequently. If we're not keeping the rest that he calls us to every 7 days, how likely are we going to be willing to keep his commands on other days? See how that works? When he tells you to do things and you find reasons not to, you're going to find reasons not to do other things as well. And that construction of 70 times 7, that's an important construction, isn't it? When Yeshua was asked about how many times should I forgive my brother when he sins against me, what does he say? 70 times 7. There's several different ways to think about that, but in some ways it's a construction saying until the kingdom of Messiah arrives, until that last day, that day of judgment. But in another ways, it's kind of suggesting this moment here from the exile that, God forgave you. You still had to endure some discipline, but 70 times 7, he still allowed them to return. He still forgave them for all of that. And if he was willing to forgive us for 490 years of disobedience, so should we, because most of us are not going to live 490 years to accrue that much debt, right? So for whatever length of time that person has sinned against you, guess what? It's not as long as you've been sinning against God, or that you as a nation have been sinning against God, and he's willing to forgive you for that. So again, if they weren't willing to keep the 7-year cycle of rest, they wouldn't be keeping the 50-year either. So for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of excuses, leaders, both political and religious, would not have the year of the Lord's favor. Even though they read about it every year in the Torah cycle and were asking that question, man, some of the questions that we've asked ourselves sometimes over the course of this journey. It says we should be doing this. Why aren't we doing it? You think they asked that question? I'll bet they did. So things like the Jubilee was never really put into practice like it was supposed to be, like God intended. And so that means that this release, that this freedom never came, that the debts were never released, that land never returned, that Jubilee essentially became a dream, wishful thinking, something to hope for, something someday over the rainbow, so to speak. See, a nation that is declining, a people that are declining, doesn't really obey God's word. But that someday, that changes when Messiah arrives. Messiah, the faithful servant, he is going to do it. He is going to make this day, this time, this year happen. He's going to do it right, because Messiah is the one who perfectly is obedient to the Torah of God. He is going to be the one who perfectly rules and reigns by God's Torah, and he's going to see that kingdom spreads over all the earth. When Messiah comes, we'll finally get to see all of these things, or the Torah fully put into effect. We'll go up to the mountain and we will learn his ways. His reign will be defined by justice, by righteousness, and holiness. That is what truly is the good news. The Hebrew word is basar, where we get the Hebrew word for besora, or the gospel. And when Isaiah, he puts it like this. He says, the Ruach Adonai Elohim is on me, because Adonai has anointed me. That's the basis of the word Messiah. He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, and to proclaim the year of Adonai's favor. This is an announcement, a proclamation, news that is supposed to gladden our souls. It's what we need to hear in uncertain days, that God has not forgotten his promise, that there is a better future that he is bringing. Even when everything seems like it's falling apart, we cannot forget this reality. This is what good news is supposed to be. I keep hearing from people, I've even talking to my mom and dad from time to time, that, the more that they watch the news, even the ones they agree with, even if they're watching good old Fox News, right? The more they watch the news, the more they get irritated and frustrated and angry and anxious. Anybody else notice that? The news today that we hear does not calm us. It does not reassure us. It does not give us hope. It actually leads us to despair. It's kind of like how we talked about looking at all the end times and the signs and all that kind of stuff that you read about, that at the end of the days, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and all those kinds of things, and people are getting more and more worked up about it, right? Well, what does Yeshua say when he talks about those things? He says, when you see these things, see that my people, see that you are not alarmed. Seeing this stuff is not supposed to make us more anxious or more nervous or more upset. It's supposed to encourage us to be more faithful, to be more trusting, to looking forward to his coming. Because what we hear and what the world is trying to feed us doesn't give us hope. It leads to despair. But that's not what Messiah brings in his coming. The Messiah brings with him the fulfillment of God's promises, and in their fullness. It's like a greater exodus for his people. It's the going into the promised land, going into the kingdom that they were looking forward to. The gospel, the good news, is not just a New Testament idea. Isaiah, he's actually been talking about it for a while. Going back to Isaiah chapter 40, he says, get yourself up on a high mountain, you who bring good news to Zion. Come, let us go up to the mountain. And that's Isaiah chapter 2. Go up to the high mountain. His is the only high mountain that matters. The kingdom of God is the only mountain that matters, the only kingdom. You're bringing good news to Zion. Lift up your voice with strength, you who bring good news to Jerusalem. Lift it up. Do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. This is so contrary to the news as we see it and hear it today, because they have no hope. They have no vision, expectation of this coming. He says, look, Adonai Elohim comes with might, with his arm ruling for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. It says, Isaiah 52, he says, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces shalom, who brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they will lift up their voices. Together they are shouting for joy, for they will see eye to eye when Adonai returns to Zion. Remember that idea about the watchmen? Y'all remember what picture that's supposed to be? Where are the watchmen supposed to be? What do the watchmen stand on when they're doing their job? They're standing in an observation post. They're standing on the walls, right? in order to be able to look out and see what's coming their way, what danger might be there, right? The voice of your watchmen, they will lift up their voices. They are shouting for joy, for they will see eye to eye when Adonai's returns. You know, it's like they're no longer going to need to be on their posts. Those walls that they're going to be standing on and walking on are no longer going to even be needed. You're going to all be on the same level ground before the King, and you'll be safe. You know, this message of good news is defining Yeshua's ministry as Messiah. The Ruach Elohim is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of Adonai's favor. That's how he wants everybody to understand what he's doing and why he's here. He then closed the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And all eyes on the synagogue were focused on him. And then he began to tell them, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your ears, in your hearing. So everything you've been hoping for, everything you've been waiting for, everything that you didn't know if it was ever actually going to happen or not, that day has arrived. You are hearing the announcement and the proclamation that Messiah has come. You have arrived at that day, and it was available to them if they could see it, if they could recognize the time of Messiah's arrival and visitation. We'll come back to that idea in a little bit, but what that day looks like, but it's what is entailed in the good news. You know, Isaiah 42, you know, the opening of that servant song identified the Messiah in those Aramaic translations, those targums. It lets us know that even those songs, even that time is connected to this day of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 42 in the Aramaic says, "Behold, my servant, the Messiah, whom I bring, my chosen, in whom one delights. As for my word, my memra," that's that whole concept. "I will put my Holy Spirit upon him. He shall reveal my judgment unto the nations." And verse 7 describes it. It says, "By opening blind eyes, by bringing prisoners out of the dungeon, and those sitting in darkness out of the prison house." Does that sound like it's a consistent message of good news? It should. And again, though that's the traditional Hebrew that we look at, we read, but the Aramaic reveals more of what the Jewish understanding of that time period was, because this prophecy was related to the Torah. It's also related to the exile. In the Aramaic, it translates it like this. It says, "To open the eyes of the house of Israel who are blind." They're not seeing everything they need to see. They're blind to the law, to the Torah, the fullness of the Torah. To bring back their captivity from among the nations where they are like prisoners, and to redeem them from the servitude of the kingdoms, being shut up as those that are bound in darkness. You know, they were understanding that many of their brothers and sisters were still scattered out around the world and not living in the promised provision of God. Even with the temple standing and in place at that time, there were still those in captivity. And now that the temple has been destroyed, now that it's gone since 70 AD, that hasn't gotten better. You know, they are still in captivity. They view that as long as we don't have the land, as long as we don't have the temple, we have not really returned. And even though, you know, many, even almost a majority of the Jewish people around the world are back in the land, the exile's still not over, because the days of Messiah have not fully arrived. This year of Adonai's favor has not been fully implemented. For some reason, even though he says these words are fulfilled, not everything has come to pass yet. And as he's there in his hometown synagogue, though around, people who had all watched him grow up in their midst, they had a hard time seeing that he was the answer to that prophecy and answer to that prayer. They were having a hard time recognizing his visitation. Luke chapter 4, verse 22 puts it like this. It says, all were speaking well of him and marveling at the gracious words coming out of his mouth. They were ready to receive it. But they were also saying, isn't this the son of Joseph? I mean, who could have seen it coming from this guy? Right? There are some people when they graduate from high school, they have the ones that are most often voted to, like run for president or something else like that. I was never up for any of those types of lists, at least not the good ones. How many of y'all were up for the not so good ones? Anybody else? Well, imagine some of those, who gets voted most likely not to accomplish anything, comes back talking like this. It's like, wait a minute now. You're doing what? I remember you when you could not even keep your glasses on your face, and you're telling me that you want to run for president? A girl wouldn't date you with a 10-foot pole or anything like that, and you're going to run for president? You're going to be that guy? No, not him. That's kind of, I wonder if that's kind of what they're thinking when they say this. Isn't this the son of Joseph? And he was good. He might have been good at reading, but I wouldn't expect him to be all of that, because we know this guy. We know his parents. He was normal. He was ordinary. He certainly didn't meet the expectations of what Messiah is supposed to be, what he's supposed to do, what he's supposed to look like, act like, all those types of things. He's not a military ruler. He's not had any victories. It's actually their familiarity with Yeshua that caused them to question how he could be the one. Or as John put it in chapter 1, he says, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. That's not just talking about Nazereth, where he grew up. That's talking about his brothers, his fellow Jewish people. But they are an example of what that statement means. And of course, and it escalates from here. Their misunderstanding of who he is. Yeshua is claiming to be. He's making the announcement that this is now happening. He's claiming to be the fulfillment of the good news that Isaiah prophesied about. But they were getting bogged down in the things that they could see, the things that they could understand. And then Yeshua really challenged them, because sometimes God goes outside the camp to speak and to reveal his glory. Sometimes he doesn't do things the way we think he should, or the way we think he's going to, right? So he comes back after they said, well, isn't this, Joseph's son? He said to them, doubtless you will say to me this proverb, doctor, heal yourself. And what we have heard was done at Capernaum, do as much here also in your hometown. You put on a show out there, well, do that around here, and then maybe we'll consider it. But he said, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. You think you know me. He says, but with all truthfulness I say to you that there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when heaven was closed for 3.5 years, and there came a great famine over the land. Elijah wasn't exactly very popular at the time. But he says Elijah was not sent to any one of those many widows in Israel, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a widowed woman. He didn't help go to everybody. It says there were many with Nazereth, with leprosy in Israel, in the time of Elisha the prophet. And none of them were purified. None of them were healed apart from Naaman the Syrian, a foreigner. Now this last one, that's significant because Naaman is the only one in the Tanakh that, as my understanding, really considered to be healed or purified from Nazereth. And again, he was a foreigner. He was a Gentile. He was a military commander of the enemy. And God healed him by a mikvah in the Jordan River. But there's no real record of a Jewish person being healed or cleansed from leprosy. And that was something, one of those signs, one of those moments for things that were revealing things that only Messiah was going to be doing when he arrives. They were talking about the 4 miracles of Messiah. We've been over these before. You know, how he is supposed to heal a man who was born blind, how he was supposed to heal a demon-possessed person that can't talk or can't speak, how he is going to raise somebody from the dead, right? Did Yeshua do all those things? Yeah, he did. You know, they even his disciples even asked him that question. You know, the first one, you know, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Right? And Yeshua comes back and says, neither. Right? This happens so that the glory of God can be revealed. There was the belief that in the Jewish world at the day, they had those people that were trying to cast out demons and such. In order for them to be able to do that, they had to ask the demon to reveal its name. And then once they learned the demon's name, then they could cast the demon out. Well, if the demon is preventing somebody from speaking, then how are they ever going to hear the demon's name, and how are they ever going to cast him out? They didn't think they could, but Messiah can. And raising the dead, you know, that only happens in special moments. Messiah is going to bring us all, there's going to be resurrection connected with him. And then one of the last signs is that he'll heal a Jewish person of leprosy. Now, all of these he did. Matthew chapter 8 records one of these moments. You know, a man with Nazereth came to him and bowed down before him, saying, Master, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Yeshua stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his Nazereth was cleansed. And then Yeshua says something that may not be as big of a deal to us because we don't understand these concepts about, oh, these are things only Messiah can do. He says this, he says, Yeshua said to him, see that you tell no one, but go and show yourself to the Kohen, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. It was a testimony to the priests because they'd never done it before. No one had been qualified to do this. No one had been made this offering because no one in Israel had been cleansed like this. You know, Mark tells us that instead of keeping it quiet and going to the priest, the man starts spreading the word so everybody finds out about it. But that also means that the miracle, that the moment doesn't get verified by the right authorities. So they didn't hear or witness or confirm or recognize the coming of Messiah because they were waiting for signs like that. And neither did Yeshua's hometown. They didn't recognize the time of his coming to announce this good news because, you know, they felt insulted at Yeshua's words about these Gentiles receiving the blessing and the grace of God. And so when he said those things to him about that widow with Elijah and about Naaman the Syrian, it says, now all in the synagogue were filled with rage upon hearing these things. And rising up, they drove him out of the town and brought him as far as the edge of the mountain on which their city had been built, in order to throw him off the cliff, off the side. Now, all of those cities back then were elevated on a mound called a tell. We call those a tell now. But they were elevated to give them greater safety in positions. But passing through the middle of them, he went on his way. The people that knew him rejected the proclamation of the good news and the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy that Yeshua, that he was the anointed one, that he was anointed as Messiah to set this off, to proclaim liberty and release and freedom, to proclaim the arrival of the Jubilee of the Messianic era. They were rejecting that message. And even at times, John the Immerser needed to be reassured that it was actual, that this was the time. As evidenced by Yeshua providing the same kind of examples from Isaiah 61. It says, when John heard in prison about the works of Messiah, he sent word through his disciples and said to him, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? Are you the one? And Yeshua replied, go and report to John what you hear and see, that the blind see, that the lame walk, those with tzaraat are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have good news proclaimed to them. He's saying everything that you see happening is what Isaiah and others have prophesied Messiah will do. The kingdom is right in their midst. It was available in that day, in that moment, but his own did not receive him. They did not say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They did not recognize the time of his visitation. They were not willing to be gathered under his wings as he prayed and wept over Jerusalem. And the blindness that he's talking about, that the blind will see. The blindness is not always a physical condition. Sometimes it's spiritual. The Aramaic, again, it revealed that they were blind to the Torah and what was truly being said. The promised kingdom was right there in front of them, ready to be taken, but they did not enter it at the time, and any more than the Israelites did when they were right there on the border of the promised land. And they sent out the 12 spies into the land. Y'all remember that? Had the 12 spies come back with a good report, how would it have been different? Had they come back and not spread this evil report about the land, about the people, about the fortifications, had they not caused the people to fear, despair, presumably that generation could have gone into the promised land at that time. But 10 of those spies did not have the same kind of sight that Joshua and Caleb had. They were blind to the power and work of God. They could have gone in, but instead, because they rejected the promise, that going into the land was delayed by 40 years. That generation essentially had to die off, except for Joshua and Caleb. That generation didn't recognize the time, their moment of entering into the kingdom. This generation of Yeshua's day did not recognize the time of the king's arrival, and 40 years later, roughly, the temple was destroyed. Entering into the promised kingdom was delayed. Yeshua's hometown didn't recognize it, and so the good news of the kingdom, does that announcement still need to be made? Does it still need to be proclaimed that Messiah has come to redeem us from slavery to sin and death? That was so much of his mission. Whose mission is it now? It's ours. Even today, there are those in captivity that need to be set free. There are those who are blind whose eyes need to be opened, both physically and spiritually. Right? This is a great day to look forward to, a day that can't get here fast enough as far as I'm concerned. It should be all of our concern that where Adonai, where Messiah is on the throne, because the world is full of broken-hearted people. It's not just out there somewhere else in the world, but we have broken-hearted even right here, even in this very room, in this city. Those who are held captive even today that need to be free, to have joy restored to their life. That not just prisoners of war or conflict, but in despair, in abuse, in all sorts of bad situations. We are all prisoners in some form or another to this world and its law of sin and death. And there are some problems that only Messiah will be able to fix, and his coming will be able to fix. We still need the year of the Lord's favor to fully arrive. We still need the Jubilee to finally come. The question is, can you see it? Do you want it the way it's needed to be? Have your eyes been open? Has your sight been restored to see Messiah Yeshua for who he is and who he has been all along, or is he still hidden from you? Because at his first coming, he came in that suffering servant as the Messiah, the son of Joseph, the one who was at first unrecognized by his own brothers. But when he comes again, he will return as Messiah, son of David, and there will be no more delay. In some ways, the first and second coming are shown right here in this one verse from Isaiah. To proclaim the year of Adonai's favor is when he stops. But that's right in the middle of the verse. Because it is his favor. He is redeeming them. He is saving them. He is making salvation available from their sin. But to proclaim the year of Adonai's favor. But then there's the second part. And the day of our God's vengeance, to comfort all who mourn, to console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they might be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of Adonai, that he may be glorified. The day of God's vengeance is when he is righting all of the wrongs that have been done. When all of the burdens, when all of the brokenness, when all of the things that we have lost are restored, to know that God's justice is coming is also a comfort for those who have been victimized by this world of sin. But it's by our faith. It's our hope in Messiah. He talks about being called oaks of righteousness. It's like being planted in his garden, in his vineyard, in his grove, that he is cultivating us to be more and more fruitful. That's what we must be ready for. That's what we don't want to miss, that we don't want to not recognize the time of his returning visitation. Because we need to be consoled. We need to, all those things. We need to have our oil of joy in place of our mourning. To have beauty restored to us instead of the ashes of sackcloth and things that will sit in the dust, right? But we're ready when we believe, when we trust, when we hold on to the truth and the reality of his coming and his identity and what he has done for us, the forgiveness that we have in Messiah. That's when we are ready for this day to come. Because the announcement, the shofar, the sounding of the shofar that we read about in 1 Thessalonians, that's getting closer and closer and closer. When the year of Adonai's favor, when that time of Jubilee and the release of the captives, the restoration of all that has been taken, Lord, that day is coming, and it will be the year of the Lord's faith. And we need that day, don't you?